Hi and welcome to my video on social facilitation and inhibition. So just starting off as always with a couple of definitions. Okay, social facilitation talks about how the presence of an audience has a positive effect on performance, and we look at social inhibition where arousal stimulated by the presence of an audience has a negative effect. I'm going to look how that is affected by different personalities, looking at stages of learning as well, and you'll see how all this sort of comes in with the content that you've been taught in previous lessons. So it can affect, look at personalities first. So we're looking at introverts. Now they can become very aroused very quickly, or over-aroused very quickly and easily. And for introverts, an audience is more likely to cause inhibition. So remember, inhibition is where it is bad. Okay, so if an introvert, it tends to be you get social inhibition, where the presence of an audience can make performance less effective. Extroverts do not become over-aroused as easily, so an audience is more likely to cause facilitation. So you think about your big extroverts, they tend to enjoy an audience when they're performing, so you have a think about that. Again, stages of learning. So you've got to think back to where we were at the very start of the course. We looked at stages of learning. As arousal increases, so does performance of the dominant response, which is the habit. For beginners, this is likely to be incorrect, so social inhibition occurs. So you've got to think about when you're at the cognitive stage of learning or a beginner, the dominant response isn't always correct. So social inhibition, an audience can make their life a little bit more tricky when trying to perform a skill. Experts have well-grooved dominant responses, and raising arousal due to the audience facilitates their performance. This is known as the drive theory of social facilitation. So remember back the drive theory for arousal. Okay, it's the same here for social facilitation and inhibition. So just pan out on this and you can have a look at the slide in total. Okay, so we're looking here. I'd imagine we'd say that Usain Bolt was an extrovert and he loved the crowd. So it's quite a good example of social facilitation. I think he performs better when the world is watching him. Again, with this skier, it's looking at an expert skier compared to over here, you've got a beginner. So if I was teaching this young boy how to ski, you're probably better off taking him off to one side and having close one-to-one lessons, making sure nobody's watching and making fun of him, when you might think this person here might prefer to perform on the big stage. Alright, so just pan out so you can have a look at that and maybe want to pause it and read over it. And we're moving on again to how facilitation inhibition helps different groups of people. So we'll look here, it can be the skill. So if we take a simple and complex skill, the presence of an audience adds to the information to be processed by the performer. Simple skills do not require much information processing, so the audience does not cause information overload, and facilitation can occur. For complex skills, the audience can cause overload and inhibition. This is known as a distraction conflict. So if you think as a complex skill, you've already got lots of things to process. But on top of that, you're going to have the audience. So quite often for a complex skill, an audience can often result in social inhibition. There's just more things to process. But again, you're going to tie that in with your stages of learning. And there's an example over here. This is a fairly simple skill, and so the presence of an audience will not have too much impact on that. Moving on to the skill type, whether it's gross or refined. Gross skills do not need high levels of precision. We know that from week 1. And increased arousal from the presence of an audience tends to facilitate their performance. So think about gross motor skills. Here's a man throwing a hammer. You might want to think about rugby. Gross motor skills where precision isn't particularly important and the audience can bring about social facilitation. Fine skills can inhibit the presence of the audience, as a performer must work with the high levels of precision, which is more difficult with raised arousal. Now they've given the example of Shane Warne bowling his leg spin, I would maybe think about the difference in crowds between a rugby game and a snooker game. So in snooker, you're expected to keep very quiet and very still to make sure there isn't too much for the players to process, because it's maybe a complex skill, a fine motor skill, playing the right snooker shot. Whereas in rugby arena, very loud, very raucous, but again, it's mainly gross motor skills on the rugby field. So the last bit down here, we're looking at a theory suggested by Cottrell in 1968, suggesting that an audience inhibits performance if the performer perceives that the audience is judging them. So we're looking at evaluation apprehension. For example, if a significant other, so a talent scout or a parent, is in the audience, or a performer believes the crowd to be knowledgeable and able to form opinions. So evaluation apprehension is where in the crowd you think there is a significant person in there coming to watch you, and this can bring about apprehension towards your performance. So they've used a great example here. If a talent scout comes to watch you, or your parents that maybe don't watch very often, this can result in evaluation apprehension. Again, in the refereeing world, I know that when in the past I've been observed about my rugby refereeing, if I have got somebody there who is coming to do an evaluation on me or a critique on me, come to watch me referee, I actually quite enjoy that. And so it's about the effect of that person. It can either be a positive or a negative outcome. And then there's the last bit at the bottom. However, extrovert or autonomous individuals may rely on the audience evaluation to increase arousal to the optimum levels. So this is what I'm saying down here. I am an extrovert, and I would say I'm autonomous, and I do actually like the thought of a significant person or a crowd watching me, because it gets me to my optimum levels. It'd be worth just you thinking in your own life where that fits in with you. So I'll put the slide on its full, and you can have a little pause and have a look at that slide. The final part of social facilitation and inhibition is the strategies to minimise social inhibition. So coaches can use a range of strategies to reduce this. So if you have a look down here, first of all, manages arousal, mental rehearsal, picturing the physical skills in the mind to combat cognitive anxiety, positive self-talk, negative thought stopping. So think about that mental rehearsal to try and stop social inhibition. Then we can look at forms positive dominant responses. If you practice to groove, you overlearn your skills, make the performer aware of the link between the appropriate arousal and effective concentration, so cue utilization, really making sure that you've got your plans in place, your skills in place, they're overlearned, and they should be able to be replicated when the crowd is present. Increases in confidence, so positive reinforcement and social support from the coach or the teammates. Attributing success to internal factors such as coping with the crowd, and build self-efficacy by verbal persuasion, reminding of previous success when playing in front of an audience. So again, past experiences, when you've done well in front of a crowd, make sure we're highlighting this as a coach or a captain or even just your teammates. Cope with distraction from the audience, practice in the presence of the audience. So I remember the England football team, leading up to one of the tournaments, they did some penalty shootout practice in front of the audience. Now what they're saying with England in the football is that we do suffer from social inhibition when we get to a penalty shootout, that the crowd and the pressure of it can have a detrimental effect. And practice selective attention, focus on the relevant cues, blocking out the audience. If you speak to Johnny Wilkinson, not that I've done that, but in one of his interviews, he said before his kick in the World Cup, he said he could recognise there was a noise in the ground, but all he was focused on was the ball coming towards him and him doing that drop goal. So he says he can hear it, but he pays absolutely no attention to it whatsoever. All right, that concludes social facilitation inhibition. Again, you might want to pause this slide just to make sure you're happy with ways to stop social inhibition.